Becoming Bangalore was both enthralling and unnerving for me. Enthralling because it's brilliantly written, it's witty, charming, funny, and Rupa really brings to life vivid anecdotes from the city's past and present. It was unnerving because it only seemed to highlight how patchy my own knowledge of the city is. I like to think of myself as a curious person. And having lived for many years on Cunningham Road, curious me never thought to ask about the genesis of the road's name, which, by the way, Rupa tells me was named after Francis Cunningham, who was a private secretary to Mark Cubbon, whom the famous park is named after. There's also been this calendar that's always been hanging on one of our walls. It's a black and red Bangalore Press calendar, and so far I've always thought it was kind of unappealing and Amma's boring calendar. Amma's in the audience, by the way, today. But it was after reading Rupa's piece on this, I realized it's so cleverly designed. It covers all the, the Raukalas, Yamagandas, as well as all modern temporal markers like World Book Day and Copyright Day, World Intellectual Property Day. It's a remarkable calendar. So Rupa, thank you for writing this book. I mean, you've done what the best writers do, which is to make the mundane and familiar sort of, make us look at it with new eyes. So I want to start, I think you wrote this as a series of columns for the Hindustan Times. How did you do your research for this? Because you've really uncovered fascinating material.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Yellarigu namaskara. Very, very happy to be here and to see this huge and wonderful turnout. I'm pretty nervous, actually. I never thought on a weekday evening there will be so many people who have come. Thank you so much. I know this is Bangalore. You could be doing a million different things on a Tuesday evening, including being stuck in traffic. But, you have actually managed to make it here in time and be here and fill the room. It really warms my heart. It just tells me that people are still very, very curious about their city. How many of you were born in Bangalore? Okay. And
including me.
Yeah, me. I'm third generation Bangalorean. I have put my flag there. Nobody can mess with me. My credentials are, impeccable. And how many of you have come here because you want to know a little more about Bangalore and you've just moved or something? Wonderful. This is the kind of breakup you usually get in any kind of crowd in Bangalore. You'll always get only about something like 24 to 30% of Bangaloreans are Kannadigas, first of all. How many people speak Kannada? Okay, that's not bad at all. Thank you. That's very good. That's unusual, actually. So thank you for coming. Now, to answer your question, Brinda, thank you so much for saying all those nice things about my book. This book has been getting a lot of love, and I think it's only because, this is that kind of city, and what I've tried to do through this book is only to remind people about what a lovely city they live in, that they are fortunate enough to inhabit, because just now the narrative has become so toxic about Bangalore, whether it's about the heat, about builders, construction, traffic. Politicians, whatever, and we forget, somehow we get into this sort of little well of our own echo chambers, and we keep saying the same things to each other, and we begin to believe that this is true. And in fact, I have never been able to hear or say anything terrible about Bangalore. Because, if you just shift your perspective, shift your lens a bit, if you have gone and lived in other cities in India or the world, you will always come back and say, Nam Bangalore bestappa. The kind of relief you get when you get off the plane in the Bangalore airport. I'm home. You want to actually bend down and kiss the soil. I mean, that's mine, especially in the summer. This is what I have to say. So yes, it's true that this is a collection of columns which I started writing more than 4 years ago. It's a fortnightly column. I still write it. In fact, today, the 105th column or something, the 106th column has just come out. It started with the editor. They were starting a Bangalore edition of the Hindustan Times, not a physical edition. It was only an e-edition. And the editor who I had worked with decades ago as a young journalist at Business Today, he reached out and said, we're starting a Bangalore edition, and would you like to write a column? And I've never written a column in my life before. But, you know, when somebody says something about, would you do something about Bangalore? My head automatically goes into nod. So I said, yes, sure, let me try this. And I started it. I had not imagined the kind of discipline and rigor it would take to produce something every 15 days. And the tyranny of the word count. A column is very, very short. At least this column is only 600 words long. And within 600 words, I have to begin a story, I have to give it meat in the middle, and I have to end it so that it stands by itself. It's not a serialized book or anything. It has to stand entirely by itself. I can't tell you how much it has helped me as a writer, that discipline to express succinctly and with economy, but with humor and with to keep it engaging. So it's been a great ride. I want to submit here that I have never missed a fortnight. Whether I've been traveling or wherever I've been, it has always been there. Because it really recharges my fortnight. I feel so rejuvenated once I've written that column. I can take on whatever the world can bring, because it has allowed me to dive into the city, into research, and find out things. And find and uncover some aspect of my city that I was not aware of before. You asked me, what was the research process like?
I mean, where did you get this material? You know, what kind of sources did you use? And because it's not easy to stumble on these stories.
Right,
so, yeah.
But I've had plenty of practice. That's the thing, because for more than 20 years now, my husband and I have run a company called Bangalore Walks, which has been leading heritage and history walks across Bangalore. We were the first heritage walking company to come into Bangalore 20 years ago in 2005, maybe 2004 end. And we had just returned from the US, and we were saying we were both free. He wasn't employed by any corporate. I was free. So we said, let's start something. Our kids were very young. And the original thought was we should do something for Hampi, because we came back from the US, which is not even as old as Bangalore. The whole country is not even as old as Bangalore. And yet they celebrate their history so much. Every little monument is made so much of. There are souvenir shops, interpretation centers, guides, audio tours. And we said, we have Hampi. You know, it's a World Heritage Site, and there isn't even an interpretation center there. This was 20 years ago. Maybe it wasn't even a World Heritage Site at that time, I don't remember. Maybe it was. So we said we should do something there. But then our kids were very young. It would take like 8 hours by road to Hampi and back. We said, not tenable. So what else can we do? And we said, Bangalore, really? Does Bangalore have any history? Isn't that the kind of reaction most people have to Bangalore? It's like modern, it's cool, it's IT, it's biotech, it's fun, it's pubs, it's all of that. But history, no, may not be. Because when people come to Bangalore, when we have guests and they say, show us Bangalore, take us around, Bangaloreans are an utter and complete loss. Where do we take them? What do we show them? There are no palaces, nothing. So in the end, Vidhan Soda, okay, which is only built in 1956, by the way.
Yeah.
And then Lal Bagh Carbon Park.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Come, let's go to a pub, let's go to a bookstore, let's go to Church Street. Okay, so that's the end of it. So we were in the same situation, but then we said, there must be something. And then we went to the original sources, the Mysore Gazetteers, the Mythic Society libraries, archives. And when we began to look, we were stunned at the amount of history there was in Bangalore. And we both have been talking and walking Bangalore for 20 years. So it was not so difficult. So we had done most of the primary, fundamental kind of research. But when you write, so that when you're speaking, when you're taking people on a history walk and nobody's recording, you can get away with saying some things that may not be entirely accurate. But when you write stuff down and it puts it in print, then you have to go back and check everything. And while you're doing, and what has happened in the last 20 years is that the internet has exploded. So it's so convenient and it's so fascinating to go down rabbit holes in the internet and uncover little nuggets of information, and helps you connect all kinds of dots and make all kinds of connections. So that has helped me a lot. And because I have to keep writing every fortnight, all the information I had was not enough. It was just a sort of base on which I built. So it was easier for me, yeah.
Right, yeah. I think for those of you who have the book, it also has a beautiful cover. It's a stunning cover which opens out, and it has events inscribed on the inside. So don't know if you've seen it, but it's like, so can you tell us a little bit about the thought that went into designing this, Rupa?
Yeah. So I'd been writing the columns for a while, and then so people used to keep telling me you should compile them into a book. You keep sending us these columns, but we want to have all of them in one place. So I went to a publisher finally. I just sort of informally with my publisher, Hachette, who published all of my other books, most of my other books. And I just mentioned, there is this idea, but I didn't think they may want to publish something about a city books because I am usually a children's writer. So they publish my children's books. I just mentioned it, but somehow they got excited and they said, okay, let's do this. And we chose 75 columns to put into this book. That was the hardest thing. To decide which ones not to include in the book was the hardest thing. But once we had decided that, we chose the illustrator, Priya Kurian. She's also from Bangalore. And she also has come into Bangalore only about 7-8 years ago. So she's also wide-eyed and discovering the city. So we thought perfect. And this editor, Vatsala Kaul Banerjee at Hachette, me and Priya had worked 16 years ago on my very first series of children's books. So we all know each other's, we get along, we vibe well together. So we said, okay, let's do this. My God, it took so long to come up with this cover. Every cover, she came up with so many options. We gave her so many options, but there were so many different elements. I wanted all of them on the cover. I didn't want to leave anybody out. This queen, this divan, this British commissioner, I wanted all of them on the cover. So it took a long time, but then suddenly after we were really despairing, this came out for the Bangalore Lit Fest. It came out in time for the Lit Fest, and that was December 13th, 14th. I think we finally decided on the, froze on the cover early November or something. Finally, it was so close to the wire. But once we saw this version, we were instantly, yes, this is it. Let's just do this. And then by this time, Hachette had got excited. So they said, we were saying, let's do a hardback. Because hardback is, a keeper. So let's do a hardback, let's not do paperback. And then they came up with this very innovative thing of a paperback with a dust jacket, which is not usual. And it added so much, and they said, we'll do something on the inside. And it turned out to be such a beautiful cover. So all credit to Priya Kurian. Please look her up. She has a fantastic Instagram page. She's amazing.
Yeah, it can actually be framed as a poster.
Yes, I think that was also the thought, particularly the inside, right? Because it has the schedule of events in the city. And it's the same cover here. So we thought you could put it up on your board so that you remember you never miss an event in Bangalore. Yeah.
You've also organized the material according to seasons and trees. So can you tell us about the thought that went into that? It's not like chronologically arranged, or,
Yeah, that was another god. So there were 75 columns. And each of the columns, every fortnight, I had written according to my whim, whatever I felt like writing that day. And in the first year of writing the columns, perhaps it was just really random. After the first year, I began connecting it to some event that was happening in the city at that time, around that time.
Right.
So we had that kind of connect, but how do you organize that into a book? How do you slice and dice it? So there are the conventional ways. You can do it by chronology, the first column to the 75th kind of thing, which didn't make any sense at all. We could do it by theme, people, institutions, places, festivals, that kind of thing. Okay, but what ends up happening in that case is that either some sections are heavily populated and others are not, or there is so much overlap between sections that one column would be about people also and institution also. So in which section do you put it? Then we said, should we do it according to geography so that it serves as a kind of helpful guide to people who want to go visit these places? You can see all these places within a walking distance, like a 15-minute neighborhood. We create 15-minute neighborhoods which are all walking distance. And we said, but how to divide the city? It's grown so big. Of course, most of the action is in central Bangalore because it's historical. But even then we said, okay, shall we divide it according to the Lok Sabha constituencies? And then we said, okay, we are really losing our minds now. That we can't do it that way. And then suddenly I said, then we started brainstorming, what defines Bangalore for me? And what defines Bangalore for me are the flowers. And there is a reason why in every season a different flower is in bloom in Bangalore. because these trees were planted to a plan by a German horticulturist called Gustav Krumbiegel. He was poached by the Maharaja of Mysore from the Maharaja of Baroda after he'd finished his service there, and he was brought here and said, green my city. And Lal Bagh served as the nursery. It was already a botanical garden. They had so many different kinds of exotics there. And they said, okay, go out and green the city. And he specifically chose avenue trees that would bloom, that would bloom according to the season. So in every season of the year, if you look up, you will see a different flower blooming. So there's always tree flowers blooming in Bangalore. And I said, that is what is truly unique to Bangalore. Somebody thought about it and did it according to that. And if you see even now, yeah, sure, Outer Ring Road and all that, they're quite like deserts, but now Tabebuia rosea is blooming all over. So even now, the BBMP, for all its faults, the horticulture department is planting flowering trees even there. So that seemed to define Bangalore more than anything for me. And that seemed a good way to divide it according to the calendar year. So events in the columns that had some bearing on that season, in the sense something that happened in the column happened in that month or whatever, I divided it like that. And then it was easily possible through some very clever tweaking to make sure there were exactly the same number of columns in each section. So we have, the sections are
Gulmohar.
Yeah, Gulmohar, Champaka.
Yeah.
Champaka is the Sampige. And then African tulip, which is the Uchekai. And pink trumpet, which is Tabebuia avellanadia. Yeah, the thing that everybody goes to Cubbon Park for in December. Yeah, to go to Ringwood Circle and watch the Tabebuia in bloom. Yeah, so those are the 4 sections.
Yeah. No, lovely. I think that's like, as you said, that's the singular aspect of Bangalore, just those. We need a Krumbiegel back here, though, I think.
Yeah.
Can we start by talking about something that's like, I think, resonant of the past and present, a festival where a male priest dons a saffron sari and bangles and then heads out into a procession. So can we start by talking about that?
And we couldn't have chosen a more apt thing to begin with, because we are in the middle of Karaga right now. Bengaluru Karaga is going on right now. On the full moon of Chaitra, which is 15th April, is when the Karaga procession will happen. So Karaga is a Nada Habba, like it's a Bengaluru Habba. Like Nada Habba for Mysore Kingdom would be Dasara, but for Bangalore, it is Karaga. And I think in so many ways, Karaga epitomizes the spirit of Bangalore. And I'll tell you why. I know there's a lot of noise online, especially about everybody beating everybody on the head saying you should learn Kannada, or I won't learn Kannada, who wants to learn your stupid language, all the rest of it. But Bangalore's main festival, or the festival that is considered the festival of Bangalore, was started, or is the festival of Tamil-speaking community, of a Tamil-speaking community called the Tigalas, and it happens in the heart of Kempegowda's Bangalore, which is the original built city of Bangalore. So, even in the heart of Kempegowda's Bangalore, it is not only Kannadigas that celebrate, but it has come to us from the Tamil-speaking Tigalas. Now, who are these people? So the temple itself is strange in itself. Yeah, it's not a temple to Shiva. It's not a temple to Vishnu. It's not a temple to Parvati, to Shakti in that sense. And it's about 800 years old is the story. It predates Bangalore itself. The temple is to Dharmaraya, Yudhishthira of the Pandavas, but that's just called the Dharmaraya Kovil. But actually, who is the person, the deity that is being propitiated during Karaga is Draupadi. Have you ever heard of a festival where Draupadi is the main Shakti, is the feminine that is being celebrated, that is being revered? And Draupadi, not in an anthropomorphic form, but Draupadi as water. Okay, now water is something that either is too much or too little in Bangalore recently. Either we're getting flooded or there is no water, one of the two things. But water has a huge, if you just think about it, water has a huge bearing on Bangalore.
Yeah.
In the sense that we are a city on a hill. We are not a city by a coast. We are not a city by a river. Why would anyone build a city, a medieval city, not by a river or not by the sea? That in itself seems like a slightly strange thing to do for Kempegowda. But why he did it was that height used to offer protection, is to offer like defensibility. When you build your city on a height, you can watch for miles around for enemies coming. So that was one reason why he built it on a hill. But because we are on a hill and not near a river, water has always been a problem in Bangalore. Kempegowda thought of ingenious ways to make water available. Because when you're built on hills, there are slopes, right? And there are ups and downs. So wherever the rainwater used to run off and collect at the lower places, a more plateau kind of place, those were natural water collecting places. And he chose those and fortified them and made them into tanks.
Yeah.
And then he designed an ingenious system of canals that connected one tank to the other so that there was always an overflow would go off into another tank. All that is now disappeared, of course, most of it. We have, we have drained the lakes and the tanks. We have built housing complexes and stadiums and all the rest of it over there. So a festival that celebrates the feminine as water is obviously going to be very popular. Now, why the Tigalas choose water is that they are gardeners.
Yeah.
The Tigalas are a green-fingered, flower-growing, vegetable coaxing out of the soil community, fruit-growing community. They are very, very good gardeners. And they were here already, even before Kempegowda came. And Kempegowda perhaps chose, because of that temple was maybe one of the reasons why he chose to build his mud fort of Bengaluru around it. And perhaps they helped him a little with a garden that he had started, a tota called Kempu Tota, in the region of today's Lalbagh. Okay, and tota is very different from the English conception of garden. A tota is a place that grows useful things, not rolling lawns. What is the point of that? In a hot country, what are you going to do with a rolling lawn except fry? So he grew roses and flowers there for worship. That was what his tota was for the temples, to grow flowers for worship. Also, the weather was perfectly suited to growing flowers. So Kempu Tota, the Tigalas were there. But not so they continued, I suppose, for a while. We don't hear about them very much during Kempegowda's time. Then Hyder Ali comes in, 1750 or so, 18th century, and he takes over, he usurps the Mysore crown, Mysore throne for himself, although the king continues to be on the throne, but he becomes the de facto ruler of the Mysore state. Hyder Ali was the commander-in-chief of the Mysore forces. And he had a great love for gardens. Like many Muslim rulers, he also had a great love for gardens, and he made Lalbagh into a rose and cypress garden, designed like a Mughal garden with the terraces and the flowing water and, all kinds of beautiful trees, roses, lots of roses and cypresses and all that. His son, Tipu Sultan, was even more of an eager gardener, enthusiastic. When he used to send, diplomatic missions off to France, across the waters to, because he wanted to ally with France, he and his dad allied with France against the British, so they would send diplomatic missions to Louis XVI and people like that. His ambassadors would be told, on the way back from France, wherever the ship docks, I want you to get me seeds and saplings from all those places, and I want to plant them in Lalbagh. If you notice, Lalbagh is just a Hindi version of Kempu Tota, right? So he said, and this was not the only Lalbagh. Tipu had 3 Lalbaghs, one in Sira, one in Bangalore, one in Srirangpatna. And everywhere he would bring in these exotics and he would grow. And he was a very enthusiastic planter, not like roses and cypresses and just plant everything, just plant flowers and fruits and vegetables from all over, eucalyptus from Australia, pomelo from somewhere. Bring all the things and plant all the exotics in Bangalore, and the weather was such that things would grow. So Hyder got the Tigalas from Madras, from the Madras region, because he said, we are gardeners, we love gardens, come. And then once a larger number of Tigalas came and began to grow the gardens here, Karaga became more and more prominent because it was their festival. And do you see the connection about why a gardening community should choose water as their goddess? So that was what it is. And on 15th, what will happen now is the whole of the central fort area of Bangalore will erupt into color and sound. And there will be a male priest who's wearing saffron sari and bangles and carrying the karaga, which is a unbaked mud pot on his head. They train for years for this, the whole year, so that they don't drop it and all that. There's quite a lot of floral decoration on top, like a huge tower on his head. And he's waiting for the moment when Draupadi manifests as water in the pot. And when she does, the Veera Kumaras around, the young men with swords who protect Draupadi, who protect her, will, start saying Dikti, 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 and then the procession goes through all the towns of the old city, and also stops at the Hazrat Tawakkal Mastan Dargah. That has, for blessings of the Sufi saint, and then it will finally finish. And the first day, where they take water from, Kaban Park. There is a little lake. So there are 11 water bodies, and every day of the 11-day festival, water is collected from somewhere else, and the puja continues, and on the final day. So as I said, it's such a syncretic, kind of inclusive festival, linguistically, religious, if you look at religiously, gender-wise, in every way, it's such a inclusive festival that I think it truly represents the spirit of Bangalore.
Right. I think at least the Tamilians can be reassured that your birthright citizenship will never be removed from Bangalore. But
nobody's will be.
Yeah. So can we dwell now on the path-breaking Kannada women writers, the Kannada Kadambari movement, which was sparked off in the 1940s.
Yeah.
And these women tackle topics that, would be taboo even today in some circles, like oppression inside marriages, love, romance, sexual and financial independence of women. So can we talk about these very bold women who also garnered very large audiences? It was, yeah.
So, the Kannada Kadambari, or the novel, it came into its own in the 50s or so, right? Because the modern Kannada renaissance, even in writing by male writers, only began to a turn of the 20th century. That's when a new style of writing came in, and people started experimenting with different kinds of writing. And there was one writer called B.M. Kantaya. So he was one of the,
Triveni's uncle.
Yeah. So he was one of them. And then Kuvempu and all the rest of them came in, and it became a very, very vibrant movement, because it was Kannada literators who led the campaign for a state, for a Kannada-speaking state, with borders being redrawn. Okay, so it was Kannada literators that did that. It didn't used to, before that, you know what it was like. Karnataka was all over the place. There was the Mysore Kingdom. That was a contiguous and integrated kind of area for a very long time, Kannada-speaking area. And then there were Hyderabad, Karnataka. There was Madras Presidency. There was Bombay Presidency. The Marathi areas like Belgaum and all were belonging to the Bombay Presidency. Places like, which parts would have been the Tamil Nadu, Madras Presidency, there would have been some. And Hyderabad, Karnataka would be Bijapur and all these places. Then there were independent princely states. And around 1915, truly, or even before that actually, there was an Alur Venkatraya from Dharwad. And he began to say that...
His great-granddaughter's here, but okay.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, how nice. So he was the one, he was a journalist and all, and he began the campaign for integrated Karnataka. Karnataka Eki Karana, let's do this. Let's bring all the Kannada-speaking people into one state. And that whole campaign was led by literators, like all these. Kannada Sahitya Parishad was formed in 1915 or so, and then they really had a platform, and they went after it. So that was all good. But for Kannada women writers to begin writing, first of all, there had to be about women's issues. First of all, there had to be a pool of reading women, educated women, literate women who could read. And that sort of came to a, what do you call that? Had quorum on that by about 1940 or so. And then the women began to write. And it's funny how this particular column was written. I was never meaning to write about the Kannada Kadambari at all, or Kannada Kadambarikaras. I came upon an Instagram post. These are the ways in which my columns are written. There was an Instagram post by somebody called Anusha Kumar, who had just received, in the US, US or Canada, had received a PhD in psychology, some branch of psychology. And she wrote that this is dedicated to my grandmother. And the grandmother I never knew, and the grandmother even my mother didn't know, because the grandmother died 9 days after delivering my mother. And then she wrote, her name was Triveni, and that went viral, okay, the novelist Triveni. And something rang a bell in my head, and I said, I remember my mom used to read books by this Triveni. And I began to research, and otherwise in my mind, in memories of my childhood, there were always a stack of books on my mom's bedside table, and she was always reading, and the only thing that mattered to me was when she was deep in a novel, if we asked her for something, she would say yes, without realizing. So that's the only thing I knew. And we would go to the Century Club library, and she would pick up a next stack and come. So then I said, who's this Triveni? And I began reading, and then what I found out really blew my mind, because Triveni was B.M. Shree's niece, so she came from a literary family. She herself suffered depression and things like that. She had many miscarriages, married young, many miscarriages.
Died young as well.
Died very young, 34. But her first book of short stories came out at 22. And by the age of 34, she had written so many path-breaking novels that talked about this, the kind of captivity, the kind of difficulties within marriage, and because of not being financially independent, how they impact a woman's mind particularly, how she felt trapped and things like that. She wrote about these things, which is okay. That's one part of it. But what I was more familiar with was in the 70s, there were this series of Kannada movies, 70s, 80s, made by a fabulous director, very celebrated director called Puttanna Kanagal. And I had seen all these films. And these films were all based on Triveni's novels. Sharapanjara, Belli Moda, Hoovele Chiguridaga, Hannele Chiguridaga. All these movies were made on those. And I had never connected who wrote these books that were made into these movies. And then I began to read more about Kannada novelists, and I came across Vaidehi, M.K. Indira, who wrote Paniyamma. And then there was this French teacher called Usha Navratnaram, who wrote the most potboiler novels that my mom used to adore. So then I said, my God, what happened to these people? Because just now, there are no Kannada women novelists that of that stature, of that popularity. There are no names that I can immediately come up with. So I don't know, that was a movement that happened. It seems to be over. I'm hoping something will begin again.
I hope that's a void that's filled soon. Because I hear that a lot of young Kannada writers, I'm not sure. Yeah.
But I think the internet has come in, so things have changed. At that time, it was only, everyone used to read books and novels. But I think there is room, so I hope people will begin to write soon.
Okay, getting to a topic that's probably popular among a lot of people, Tindi Uta, can we talk about how a humble coffee club on Lal Bagh Fort Road became like this South Indian, icon. International icon.
Yeah, international icon, MTR, of course, the Mavalli Tiffin Rooms. How many of you have been to MTR?
Or not been to MTR?
Not been to MTR, better. Not been to the Lal Bagh MTR? Okay, very few, excellent. So what do you think of it? Do you like MTR? The food, yeah, okay. No, because nobody argues with me about MTR. MTR is way up there because it's one of those things, because it turned 100 last year. 100. Imagine a restaurant turning 100 in a world where food tastes particularly are so fickle, so whimsical. Everybody is always looking for the next big food experience. Oh, some strange kangaroo cuisine is being served. Okay, we'll go there. Crocodiles, okay, there. So everybody is always looking for the next big experience.
I don't think they last a few months today on 12th May at least.
On 12th May. Yeah, there are some on 12th May that have lasted quite long. But MTR 100 years is really quite crazy. Yeah. I don't think there is any other restaurant in Bangalore that is 100 years old. Modern Cafe? Okay, is it 100 years old? Is it 99? See, it's not 100. MTR is 101 already. Okay, nice, thank you. Thank you, I should go and check it out, yeah. So anyway, MTR, it started as a small thing, and then in 1924, the thing was, first of all, restaurants itself were a new idea. Because of all the caste purity business, the Brahmins would not eat outside of home, and they would not, and if if the Brahmins don't do it, nobody else will do it. It's one of those things, you hate on them, but unless they are the thought leaders also. If they do it, then everybody else does it. Everyone's always trying to be like them. So unless this had happened, it would never happen. But 1898, the plague swept through Bangalore. There was a huge plague in Bangalore, a huge epidemic. And the city, Kempegowda city that we were talking about, that little fort town where Avenue Road is there, Chickpet, Balepet, that area, so insanitary, so congested, was deeply affected by the plague. Lots of people died, and it had to be evacuated. Now, to rehabilitate and accommodate the survivors of the plague, new extensions had to be built very quickly, and two of those original extensions, apart from Chamarajpet, Seshadripuram had already come up by that time, were Malleshwaram and Baswangudi. So they came up in 1898, a little after that. So those two were the original planned localities of Bangalore. And that's why R.K. Narayan pinched off a bit of this and pinched off a bit of that and created Malgudi. Mal from Malleshwaram and Gudi from Baswangudi. And he created this very fictional, lovely, Mysorean kind of town called Malgudi. Anyway, so Malleshwaram, Baswangudi came up. And then, because the plague was in full flow, the women, senior citizens and children, just like COVID times, were sent away to a safer place. The men had to remain here to work. And the men clearly had no idea how to cook for themselves. So that's why restaurants started, to provide for these men whose wives had gone away because of the plague. And therefore, you had to set up Brahmin cafes so that the Brahmin men could go there and eat safely without their purity getting soiled or whatever. And of course, they were all vegetarian cafes, those. And then you must have noticed in Bangalore, there are Brahmin, many hotels or old hotels or cafes will have Brahmin attached to them. That usually nowadays it just means vegetarian. And then if it's called military, then that means it serves mudde with mutton saru. Koli saru, mutton saru, so that becomes the military hotel.
Or it's called pure veg.
Pure veg. Pure veg is all new, but Brahmin said it. That was the, that was the way, that was the code that it was going to be a vegetarian restaurant. So, but MTR came up a little after that. I mean, they had a smaller establishment before, but truly they became MTR in 1924. And even then it wasn't called MTR, but sort of the lineage started from there. And then came the World War. And during the World War, because of rationing, there was no rice. There wasn't enough rice. But everybody wanted idlis. So MTR invented the Rava idli, which is still one of their top-selling items. And the aloo bhaji, they serve it with alugade palya, is amazing. It's only served there with that alugade palya, and it's really good. So please have it if you haven't, Rava idli. And then what happened, there was a split in the family, and one part of the family started making the ready-made MTR foods, which are so popular abroad with NRIs. That's what, that became a separate thing, and then that was bought by a Swedish or Norwegian company or something, so that's gone now. But the Mayas, the branch of the Mayas that kept MTR, the restaurants, are only going from strength to strength. Like the new Krishna Bhavan in Malleshwaram closed down after 70 years. Vidyarthi Bhavan, CTR, only one outlet each. MTR, first they started MTR 1924, the smaller outlets across the city, apart from the Fort Road one. Then they started going international. So now they have, I think, 6 or 7 or 8 restaurants abroad. They have one in London, they have Singapore, Dubai, Seattle, Mississauga, some strange places. All over the place they have. And everywhere they are very popular. So Hema Malini Maya is the current CEO or managing partner, and she's still got so many plans. And recently, just like last month, they released a book, The MTR Story, about the 100 years of MTR. So if you want to know more, lovely photographs, beautiful history, so you should just get that book.
Okay, so moving away from food, can we
always
talk
a difficult thing in Bangalore.
Yeah, always a difficult thing, yeah. Can we talk about this 19-year-old accounting whiz who had studied some physics earlier, but who also seemed to almost dabble in physics later, kind of like a side hustle till he got back into it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, ended up winning the Nobel Prize in physics.
Yeah.
So,
you know who we're talking
about,
right?
Talking about, right? Yeah.
So C.V. Raman he didn't belong to Bangalore at all. In this, he did a lot of his life's work in Calcutta, actually. even the Raman effect, all that was discovered there. Nobel Prize was all there. And then after all that, he was invited to Bangalore by the Maharajas of Mysore, by the Maharaja of Mysore. Now, the Maharajas of Mysore, the Wadiyars, especially after 1881, even before, but especially after 1881, when the power came back to their hands, they were the most amazing rulers. Bangalore has been very, very blessed because we've had great rulers. It could have gone any way. We were just any other town, like anybody else. The reason why we have become what we are today, a lot of it has to do with good British administrators. How lucky is that? And followed by good Indian kings who ruled us, and administrators and divans. Amazing. So he was invited by Krishnaraja Wadiyar, I think, the fourth. Maybe, whether the king, Nalvadi, but whether the king invited him or how he came, I don't know. But he came to take over as the first Indian director of the Indian Institute of Science, which was called the Tata Institute. Okay, so he comes here, he takes over as the director of the Indian Institute of Science, Indian director, and then realizes there is no physics department. He says, what is this? You called a physicist, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, to be the director of the Indian Institute of Science, and there's no physics department. So he starts looking he creates a physics department, starts looking for faculty to run the department. And this is 1933, 1936, around that time. And you know, the Mysore was a kingdom. Now we think of Mysore kingdom as, just one of those 565 princely states that joined the Union in 1947. But Mysore was so progressive and so ahead of its time in every way that they thought of themselves as an independent nation. They thought of themselves as belonging to the nations of the world. And when they cast their nets about for somebody, whether it was a horticulturist like Gustav Krumbiegel, or anybody for an architect, an archaeologist, anything, they looked worldwide. They cast their nets globally, not only in India. And then, so they said, what they started looking for was Raman and everybody else, that they said, it's 1936. What was happening in the world in 1936? Almost coming to the World War. Germany was in chaos. Europe was really, really alarmed because of what was happening in Germany. A lot of Jewish scientists had left Germany and had fled to England, to other places, more friendly nations. So they said, let's call these guys, they're the brightest guys anyway. So they are looking for a place to go, and he looked to England. He found a physicist called Max Born, who had run away, who had fled Germany, come to England, invited him to come to Indian Institute of Science. Max Born came, his wife came, they lived here for many years. They started the physics department, so that happened. And then Max Born returns, goes back and wins the Nobel Prize for physics. So we had the people of this caliber starting the physics department. And then, this is just an aside, but Max Born used to hang out, they all used to hang out together. C.V. Raman was Mirza Ismail's best friend. They were all very good friends. So the administrators, the scientists, the wealthy industrialists, they all used to hang out of an evening. And Mirza Ismail just happened to ask Max Born, we're looking for a chief architect of Mysore. We want to, have an architect. Do you know anyone? And he says, my nephew, he's in Cairo right now, Otto Königsberger. I can ask him if he's interested. So from Egypt, another Jewish architect comes, Otto Königsberger, a young man, and he builds so many of the buildings in IISc. Some of the iconic minimalist buildings that are there in IISc were built by Otto Königsberger. He also built if anybody knows, in Bal Bhavan, there is a hall. Do you know Bal Bhavan, Cubbon Park? Yeah, so that main Bal Bhavan building, it was called Victory Hall. It was built when the Allied forces had victory in 1945. It was meant to commemorate that. And Otto Königsberg, and he didn't have cement, glass, all rationed because of the World War. So he had to use local materials. He created an entirely new branch of architecture called tropical architecture, which was meant to sort of mimic the boulders, the granite boulders everywhere he could see in the Deccan Plateau. So that kind of top, prefabricated things, very light, and the kind of architecture that had natural air conditioning that would never require air conditioning. So, but poor Otto Königsberg, I'm talking more about Otto than about Raman, but anyway, what he discovered was Mirza Ismail and all the rich industrialists of Mysore who paid for these buildings didn't like his designs at all. They were like, what is this minimalist, what is this, this looks like a barn or something. Shouldn't we be building palaces? Their idea was you should build these, Doric columns and Corinthian columns and that kind of Roman forum kind of things. And this guy wasn't doing that. So he got, he got sent away soon enough. After 1945, 1946, he was like, okay, please go. But Jawaharlal Nehru called him. And he made him an architect for all the refugees after partition. They had to be quickly accommodated in homes. So you couldn't waste too much time and money and effort building homes for them. So he said, this is exactly the kind of architecture we want, prefab, it could be done in the factory and then brought and set up. Unfortunately for Otto Königsberger, those buildings did not, I think there was too much of pressure and too many to be built, and he didn't see it through properly and sort of collapsed. Some of them, it didn't actually stand. Nobody was hurt, but it was just, it didn't work out. So in Parliament, there was a big uproar and he got sent back. Poor man, when he was in Mysore, all the PWDs, who's this man? Why is he our boss? Like, why do we have to listen to him? And then he went there, but he went back and became a tropical architecture expert, and his textbooks are still used by architecture students today. Oh, okay. And he learned it all in Bangalore. Yeah. So yeah, Raman was here, of course, yeah.
So
but the good part is, I'll just add that Panchavati, which is Raman's house in Malleshwaram, has now been opened up and events happen there. So, keep an eye out and you can go and, be in Sir and Lady Raman's house. Yeah,
so talking about Raman again, I was reading some of these passages to my mom, and she said Mrs. Raman used to have heart-to-heart conversations with her mother, with my party.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure they were discussing a different kind of Raman effect. Must be the
Lady Raman, Raman's son.
Molecular makeup of their marriages, so.
Yeah. Yeah, and and C.V. Raman's son was also Radhakrishnan. He was also a very big scientist.
Yeah, they had many Nobels in
many Nobels in the family. His
Subramanian
Chandrasekhar was a nephew, so one of those really brilliant families.
Yeah.
And his grandson calls himself the Raman defect. He says, no, I'm not a scientist.
Yeah. So at one point, I think Gandhi, I understand from your book, he visited the city a few times, and in one of the Bangalore registers, he signed himself in as a farmer from Sabarmati.
Yeah.
So would you like to talk about, Bapu's forays with our city and the stories that surround that?
Sure. So I don't know what the sentiment is in the room, but I have grown up in Bangalore and Karnataka where Gandhi has always been adored. Like nobody has ever had anything negative to say about him, and I have become that person also now myself. So, and then I read a recent book about cultural investigations into Karnataka, where the writer, a very young writer, he's only 28, the book is called Rama Bhima Soma, and he talks about, casually he says about how wherever he went in Karnataka and whoever he interviewed, he just noticed something very strange, that everybody always spoke very well of Gandhi. So there is some deep connection of Bapu with this city. He was here thrice, only 3 times. First, he came in 1915. He had just come back from South Africa and was doing his thing of going and discovering India, what it's like, etc. And he was invited here by D.V. Gundappa, who's a very, very acclaimed journalist, writer, Kannada writer. And he was invited here to inaugurate something called the Mysore Social Service Society or something like that. I might be getting the name wrong, but that's what he came here first for. And he returned in 1920. He was just launching the non-cooperation movement. And the Khilafat movement was also in flow at that time. So he addressed a crowd of 40,000 people in something called the Eidgah Maidan, which is where Shivaji Nagar is now, somewhere around that area. And that was a time for bringing, the different factions together, and how Gandhi was about, we should have everybody together. So that was what he was doing then. Those were brief visits. Then, 1927, he had a little stroke. He had a kind of a stroke in February or something. He was 57 at that time. He quickly recovered and went on campaigning. Remember that 1927 was Simon Commission and all the rest of it, so he was really in the thick of it. And he was going on touring until April. April, it started with the temperatures, as you can imagine, across the country were soaring, and this man continued to keep walking and doing that. And his physician, Dr. Jeevraj Mehta, he said, nothing doing. He put his foot down. He said, you better go for some R&R for some time. I cannot allow you to roam around in the heat. And apparently Gandhi said, yeah, I'll go to Bangalore or some such. You know, where else to go for rest and relaxation? The British also thought this was the best place for R&R. Everybody thinks this is the best place for R&R. So Gandhiji also thought about it, came here, also because he had a very good relationship with Nalvadi Krishnaraja Wadiyar, the Mysore king.
We used to call him a Rajarishi.
Rajarishi,
right?
he called Mysore Ram Raja. He said this is how a country or a state should be run. So he was very fond of him. So, and Krishnaraja Wadiyar was very, very happy to welcome him. So he came by train to Yeshwantpur railway station, apparently. Got off, such a frail man. He was already very tired, but still thousands of people waiting to receive him. He conducted a little prayer meeting there and was whisked away straight to Nandi Hills. And in Nandi Hills, in the quiet of Nandi Hills, in the cool of Nandi Hills, he recuperated for 2 months. And that time he was staying in
Cunningham's
house,
yeah,
Francis
yeah.
Cunningham's house.
Yeah.
Francis Cunningham was long dead, but he didn't take the large guest house. He said, I'll just stay in the small one called Oaklands, which was Francis Cunningham's house, stayed there. Then he felt better, but doctor was still not giving him permission. So he said, you can come to Bangalore and get back into things a little, but I mean, you don't have to be so isolated, but I'm not letting you tour. So he came and stayed in Kumarakrupa guest house. So if you go to Ashoka Hotel, even today, there is a plaque. I'm sorry, I always call it Ashoka Hotel. It's actually the Lalit Ashoka, apparently, these days. But to anybody who grew up in Bangalore, it's Ashoka Hotel. So if you go there, there's a plaque saying Gandhiji conducted a prayer meeting here on these lawns, etc. So and
Gandhi Bhavan's very close
Gandhi
to it.
Bhavan's close by, the Kadi place. And when he was here, he met this guy called William Smith, who was in charge of the dairy corporation. And you know Gandhi and cows and milk and goats and all the rest of it. So he got so interested, he wanted to go visit. Today it's called NDRI. If you know, it's opposite Maiko Bosch on the Hosur Road. So that place, he went often and asking so many questions. How do you get more milk and what cows are these and everything? And there's a picture of Gandhi posing with Jill, the cow that used to give some 5,000 liters per year or something.
And 16 calves.
16 calves she birthed and some Ayrshire cow. So, you know, he was very fond of Jill. And in that register, he had signed as a farmer from Sabarmati. That was the longest stint Gandhi had spent anywhere outside the Sabarmati ashram. 4 months he was in Bangalore. Yeah.
And I think just to add to that, I think he heard a violin concert recital by Chowdiya, you know, the one that's center's named after.
The auditorium,
yeah. T.P. Kailasham cracked a joke, said, Bapu, he's a violinist and you are a non-violinist. So,
T.P. Kailasam was he always took the cake. He said, Bapu, you're a great violinist, but he's a great violinist, but you're a non-violinist. And apparently Gandhi burst out laughing. He chuckled like a child, and Chowdiya was looking very injured. Like
I think Gandhi would have been able to take stand-up comedians cracking jokes about him. But So,
right.
Yeah. Would you know, I think Bangalore's produced so many sports persons, you know, amazing sports persons.
Which is not talked about enough. We're actually one of the cities that has produced sports persons, national level, international level, in every field, actually. I mean, in so many disciplines.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about it enough,
So would you like to read the passage about, you know, this
Yeah.
team that actually embodies communal harmony as well as, you know, an amazing form of play?
Sure. These are 3-minute reads, okay? So don't worry. It won't take long. Will not bore you. Because they're only 600 words, as I said. Okay. When the iconic playback singer S.P. Balasubramanian succumbed in September 2020 to COVID-related complications, one of the most unexpected tributes to him on Twitter came from the fan club of a football team. Thank you, SPB, it read. Thank you for the song that united us all. The song in question, anybody guess? I thought I heard it. Yes, the song in question was the disco number Santoshake, Hadu Santoshake, that song, from the 1981 Kannada movie Geeta, starring the never-forgotten Shankar Nag. The football team was our own Bengaluru FC, which if you are at all a football fan, you'll know of Bangalore FC. And the fan club was, of course, the very vocal West Block Blues. They call themselves the West Block Blues, who belt out the song at every opportunity at the Fortress. Which is the Fortress? Kantirava Stadium. That's the home stadium of the Bengaluru FC. In a sporting universe dominated by cricket, Bengaluru FC's dazzling popularity is due to many, many things, including the team's excellent performances. Unlike with RCB, E Sala Cup Namde is not purely wishful thinking, where BFC is concerned. They have actually won. Its captain Sunil Chetri's top-tier footballing skills and personal charisma, of course no longer, but he was when I wrote this. Its fandom's unrelenting enthusiasm and the city's long and deep-rooted culture of football excellence. Yes, excellence. It was a Bangalore team that became the first ever Indian club to win the British-founded Rovers Cup in 1937. The name of that legendary team? Bangalore Muslims Football Club. The Rovers Cup, founded in 1890, suspended in 2001, was not India's oldest tournament. That honor goes to the Durand Cup, initiated in 1888 by the then Foreign Secretary of British India, Sir Mortimer Durand. Both tournaments were initially restricted to clubs drawn from military regiments, both Indian and British. Among the Indians who much preferred field hockey, it was only the Gurkhas who signed up for football, but the tournament was always won by British regiments. When World War II broke, British soldiers quit the subcontinent in droves, leaving the field open to Indian, military, and civilian clubs. It was Bengal's Mohammedan Sporting that lifted the Durand Cup in 1940, but by then, the Bangalore Muslims FC, or BMFC, had lifted the Rovers Cup twice. In 1937, they beat Mohammedan Sporting 1-0 in the final. Can you imagine saying this to a Bengali? But actually, they did. In 1938, the Argyll and Scottish Highlanders were beaten 3-2. The BMFC won it again in 1948 and were runners-up twice to boot. Who were these barefoot bravehearts? Yes, like most other Indian clubs at the time, they played barefoot, who called themselves the Bangalore Muslims. For starters, while their players were drawn from all sections of society, they weren't all Muslim. The 1937 squad included 4 non-Muslim players. It was one of them, Lakshmi Narayan, who scored the winning goal. Among those who began their careers with the Bangalore Muslims were Olympians, Mohammad Abdus Sattar, who not only went on to play for Mohammedan Sporting, but also coached the team in later years. Ahmad Khan, best remembered as one of the Pancha Pandavas, the 5 legendary forwards, along with Mysoreans KP Dhanraj and P. Venkatesh of East Bengal Football Club, and Mariappa Kempaiah, who had a 12-year stint with the national team and was considered one of India's best midfielders. But the BMFC was far more than just a winning football team. At a time when the country was beginning to be riven by communal conflict, it represented hope for cooperation and reconciliation. For the Indian National Congress, whose Bangalore chapter organized a grand reception in 1937 to welcome the winning team home, the boys were a living, breathing symbol of their vision of an undivided India. Remarkably, although currently foundering in the C division of the state-level league, the club still exists under the auspices of the Al Amin Trust. But the Jalebi style of play, that was their signature. What was the Jalebi style? Keep possession as far as possible and dribble, dribble, dribble in circles to tire your opponent out, has slowly but surely passed out of public memory. So that's the column. Plus, as a little bit of trivia at the end, the star midfielder of the Indian team in the 1950s and 1960s, BMFC boy Mariappa Kempaiah, was, like Tulsidas Balram, a protege of the legendary national football coach Syed Abdul Rahim. If you have seen the film Maidan, last year's biopic, that was the biopic on Syed Abdul Rahim's life. Ajay Devgan played Syed Abdul Rahim. It's a very nice film, actually. So this Syed Abdul Rahim spotted him in 1954 when he was playing for Mysore in the Santosh Trophy. Kempaiah went on to represent India at 2 Olympic Games, Melbourne 56 and Rome 1960, and played alongside the greats of Indian football, all coached by Rahim, including Chuni Goswami, P.K. Banerjee, Jarnail Singh, and Peter Tangraj. In January 2024, his biography, simply titled Olympian M. Kempaya and written by his daughter, Suma Mahesh Gowda, was released by Sunil Chetri in a glittering ceremony at the Indian Embassy in Doha.
Lovely, yeah. I think we'll just open it up for audience questions. We just have about 25 minutes left. So can you just raise your hand if you have? Yeah, there's some.
Here. Oh, somebody else. Okay.
Thank you so much for a really, really delightful session. We just have to read the book. I mean, it's just absolutely delightful.
Thank you.
You'd mentioned Triveni. Are there any translations of her work available? Do you know? Would you know? Because it would be lovely to be able to read them. I can't read them in Kannada, but it would be really nice to be able to read them in translation if it's possible.
Yeah, I am not sure, but you could check on the internet. Yeah, if it's not, then I may translate it. Like, yeah.
This was a really good session and enjoyed it. So my question is, you began by saying that only 24 to 30% are Kannadigas, and which areas of Bangalore are still Kannada majority and which areas are migrant majority, you know?
I am not sure. I know Malleshwaram has a lot of Kannadigas, who are actually Tamilians at home and Kannadigas in the street. So that used to be the kind of thing that used to happen in Bangalore. You are Ananthamurthy used to talk about a different language, a home language, a kitchen language, and a street language. And the street language used to be Kannada, and people used to speak all kinds of languages at home. And in fact, just to add that Karnataka has been greatly enriched by people of other languages. Yeah, people who speak other languages at home. So many of our divans were not native Kannada speakers, did not have Kannada as their mother tongue, including Sir M. Vishwesvaraya, including Mirza Ismail. They didn't speak Kannada at home. So many literators were not Kannadigas.
Yeah.
You know, so Dara Bendre was Marathi, Masti Venkatesh Iyengar was Tamil. So there are and they all wrote in Kannada. Nisar Ahmed was, Urdu speaking at home, but they all adored Kannada and wrote in Kannada. So, I can tell you, I'm not sure which areas still, even Baswangudi, I don't know if it's still very Kannada. I think there's a lot of mixing now that's happened. But I can tell you something that I've seen in my own lifetime. When I was growing up, the cantonment was a foreign country. It was a different planet. Okay, we used to only venture as far as MG Road, Lakeview, ice cream, watch a movie at Rex or something, and go back home to Malleshwaram. Okay, so that was, and then once in a while, we'd cross this great divide to receive somebody at HAL airport who had come, that's all. And Cooktown, Coxtown, Frasertown were all mystery. Okay, and it was same for them. People from that side never came to Malleshwaram, Rajajinagar, Baswangudi, they didn't come. But I think in 2000, what happened from the year 2000, so many people have come in from outside, and Bangalore has exploded so much to areas that I can't even pronounce, know where they are, that these two, which were little hostile against each other all the time, have now become, come together and said, who are these people? So I can tell you that much. But I'm not sure where the Kannada enclaves are, I'm not sure.
Good evening.
Maybe Jayanagar, JP Nagar.
Jayanagar, JP Nagar, perhaps, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for writing the book, Rupa. I've also read your Cubbon Park book, one sitting reading. It's beautiful. I think the city and everyone in the city is better off with your book as a guide. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you.
As someone who has celebrated and continues to celebrate the city, what do you make of the city today? I'm not sure if you've written about this in the book, but if you have, please feel free to elaborate on it here. As exactly what you said, areas that are unpronounceable names, people from all over the country, all over the world, subcontinent coming here. And it's really becoming something that it has never been. So what does it make you feel personally as a champion of Bengaluru? And what cautionary tale would you like to tell everyone here?
Okay, that's a very nice question. So here's how I have made my peace with it. That's all I can say, because I don't want to get hassled about it. Because change is the only constant. We cannot expect that things will remain in a particular way, and that's a very selfish way to be also. Because when I was growing up here, it was a great place to grow up, great schools, not much traffic in the streets, we could play in the streets, all of that was excellent, but there was nowhere to work. So once we finished college, we had to leave. Okay, so, and then I went away and lived in many cities and countries, and I came back 12 years later and found that my city had changed completely. And I was actually a little hesitant to come back saying, oh, shall I go back to my small city after living in New York and London and all? And I came back and found it could absorb me completely. There was nothing lacking anymore. We were on par with cultural activities or jobs or housing or any, of course, terrible streets and footpaths. But apart from that, it was absolutely, it suited me. It was home, and it could take all my aspirations and ambitions it could hold for me. So in that sense, so to say that, when the first mall came up in Malleshwaram, Mantri Mall, I was so upset. Why did Malleshwaram need a mall? It was perfectly nice, just little coffee shops and Malleshwaram market. But what about the people of Malleshwaram? What are the young people of Malleshwaram? They would like a mall with it. So, so I feel change is the only constant. And what I hope and actually believe is that Bangalore has always, and Karnataka, have always been places where people of different languages, religions, aspirations have passed through, lived here. So they have infected the DNA of Bangalore with a kind of capaciousness, acceptance of differences, an ability to be multilingual, multireligious, plural. Pluralism is very deep in whether you look at religious movements like the Basava Vachanas, like, the Veerashaiva movement. They're all about, acceptance, not even tolerance, a terrible word, acceptance of other people's ways of life. So I believe that will triumph in the end. People will come to Bangalore with their chips on their shoulders, and they will all fall off as Bangalore works its magic on them. And I think that's our responsibility as Bangaloreans to keep that going. Finished? One last question, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I have the mic.
Okay, sorry,
I also have a
minute.
question.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much, Rupa. I mean, the way that you speak about Bangalore, it's so infectious to watch, with a smile and like going here and there. My question to you is, it's a very simple one. Like, I'm not from Bangalore, recently moved here. What would you describe as like the top 5 picks of Rupa for, any non-Bangalorean who has just come, which kind of, which for you imbibe the spirit of Bangalore? Like,
Yeah.
this is the spirit, I don't want to go to pubs and all. Like,
No. Yeah. Cubbon Park, top. Cubbon Park, Cubbon Park, because of its location, it has always been at the intersection of city and cantonment, the old part and the new and the British part. And at independence, they decided to put them together and make them one city. So Cubbon Park has felt like even the city people own it and the cantonment people own it, and it has become the place where everybody can be themselves. Unfortunately, we only have one Cubbon Park. We should have many, many more. I think that's the need of the hour, that everywhere, every locality should have a Cubbon Park, which can, where all your differences are subsumed and everybody goes to have a good time. Top 5 is a little difficult, yeah. Okay. Food. I mean, MTR, I suppose. Only because it's like heritage. So you have to go there because that. I don't know, just walk the streets, look up at the flowers, just enjoy the alfresco cafes. This is the only city where through the year you can sit in an outdoor cafe and, shoot the breeze with anyone. You don't have to run in for air conditioning, nothing. I mean, yes, last year we had terrible summer, fine. But even now everybody will complain as soon as it hits 34, like what is going on in this city? So that will happen. But I think just let the city work its magic on you. I don't want to give you any particular place. Go to the bookstores. Church Street is fantastic. It's the only city where bookstores are opening all the time, new bookstores. In every other city, bookstores are closing down. Here, My God of Blossom has opened a 4th bookstore. I don't know what. So but there is enough of reading population to absorb the books he sells. So, yeah, I think that those are the places where, where else? Anybody else
I
has
also feel revisiting
Tipu
Russell
Sultan's
Market.
Palace, yeah, City Market. I think City Market in the morning, the flowers, you can really see the beautiful flowers and yeah. Huh? BIC is a great place, yeah, sure, yeah. Do we have time? I don't know. Nazneen has, yeah, please, sir.
This is regarding Sir C.V. Raman.
Uh-huh.
Even he was taken for a ride because the original owner of Nanjangud tooth powder
Ah,
promised C.V. Raman
I see.
that within 3 months, whatever money he gives to him,
Huh.
it will be doubled. So, unfortunately, he gave almost 90% of his Nobel Prize money to Gopal Rao.
As an investment, to invest in Nanjangud tooth powder. Okay.
He gave him 90% of that within a month
Okay.
to C.V. Raman. So C.V. Raman felt very happy. So he recommended lot of people. So invest with Gopal Rao. Within month or two, he will give back the entire amount. So C.V. Raman is recommending. So lot of people gave. And Gopal Rao simply vanished into thin air. Till today, nothing much is known about Gopal Rao. Now Nanjangud tooth powder is famous. Other peoples have taken over. His grandson or great grandson, and it is running very successful. Thank you.
Yeah, we have
Just have a corollary to that. C.V. Raman said, it is Gopal Rao who should be given the Nobel Prize. I'm sorry, I can't stand. I'm sorry.
What did you say?
He said that Gopal Rao should be given the Nobel Prize, not me.
Oh, is it?
Okay,
Oh,
okay.
really? I didn't know that.
Right.
Banker Marbella, yeah, of course.
Good evening. Thank you so much. I just wanted to, I wanted you to talk about the Pete areas of Bangalore and how did they come about and the names, like if you could just let us know a little bit.
Sure. So the Pete areas were the original Bangalore. And the good part is you can still walk down Avenue Road, which is almost 500 years old. So when Kempe Gowda, he did very well for a king, his King Achyutaraya of Hampi in a battle. And Achyutaraya said that as a reward you can have what you like, what do you want? And he said, I want to build myself a new capital. He was the chieftain of Yelahanka. He said, I want to build myself a new capital. And the permission was given. But it has to be built only within a mud fort. You can't ring it around with a stone fort because then it would become defensible against the king himself. So only Pete, no Kote. So he said, okay, fine. And he built the Pete, a mud fort, a town within a mud fort, put 8 gates in the 8 cardinal directions. And, divided it up into little enclaves, built his roads, built it to the south of the Dharmambudi tank so that water would not be a problem. Dharmambudi tank is now the Majestic bus station. But, it used to be a tank right on the northwest corner of the fort. And then he discovered, like every Bangalore builder, not today maybe, but he discovered the small problem, not enough of a native population to populate the town. So he advertised in his way, whatever. He must have said 24/7 security, there's a wall, there is water, there is bullock cart parking. No, really, he had designed it like that. And see, one thing maybe a lot of people don't realize is Bangalore's location. If you think of the map of India, bisect it north to south, okay? And then just take the southern peninsula, bisect it east to west. The 2 lines meet at Bangalore. It's exactly in the center of the peninsula, equidistant from Madras in the east and Mangalore in the west. So 2 ports for trade, and this is on the land. This is on the land route. So you get off the port of Mangalore, walk across, and then spices go. Goods that are coming from there go to the Spice Island things come back, pick up pepper from Malabar, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, and then you go. So Bangalore was very much in a very good location for trading. So he built little enclave. He called people, they came, they saw it was, and when I talk to children about this, they'll say, why do you think everybody came to Bangalore? Everybody says the weather. Okay, but I said, no, people don't usually move because of the weather. There has to be like good trading opportunities, some work-related opportunities, and there were. So he built these little enclaves. Balepete is for the bangle sellers. Akkipete, rice traders. Uparpete, salt sellers. Anchepete, post office, like, telegrams, post, Anche, that kind of thing. What else was there?
Aralepete?
Aralepete is cotton. and now it's become Cottonpet. It used to be called Arlepete. And then, of course, Chickpete, Dodpete. Dodpete was like Avenue Road. Chickpete was the east-west road. So all of this, and then people came and it became a big center for textiles. So people came, occupied these little enclaves, and even today you can go there, and even now, especially when I was getting married, trousseau was all shopped at Chickpete, like all the saris to give away to people. And then invitation cards were Mamulpete. They have like lovely stationery and paper and all the rest of it. So it continues to be a thriving hub, and even the market is there, city market is there. So flowers, fruits, vegetables from all the surrounding areas come there first. And then anything else you wanted to know? That was how what I like to say is that those 8 gates, because there wasn't enough of a native population, he opened those gates, let people come in, and those gates metaphorically are still open. And people are still pouring into Bangalore.
Actually, I don't have a question, but I just want to say it's a fantastic book. I finished reading it in one sitting. But I do want to request that we don't want to lose the history that you have in the other 75 columns. So please, we look forward to the next
Volume
book.
2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you're still writing these columns, right?
I still am,
Rupa?
yeah.
I just want to say thank you. I don't have a question, so I won't delay you. I really love listening to you anytime. Thanks once again.
Thank you. That's my mother-in-law.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a bit of an unconventional question. Like, I'm an aspiring writer, and I'm thinking of writing an alternate history novel where South India gains independence in 1947. And I want Bangalore to be the capital. So,
yes.
Could you have some advice? Do you have some advice
on writing or on
the Bangalore stuff?
On the Bangalore
like
stuff?
Bangalore history.
Well, you know, there is a book by this girl called Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan. Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan. She's a Bangalore writer, speculative fiction. She's written a book called Analog Digital. Analog Virtual. Have you read that? Yeah, you have, Acha. So that is, it's set in a dystopian future where cities become republics. And Bangalore is one of those cities. And the thing is, if you are not accepted into the haves, you only go back to an analog world. Only these guys have access to the virtual world. It's a very nice book. Read it. It'll give you some ideas of. And another, I just want to I want to give you another anecdote. You know, when Tipu Sultan was conferring with the French, and they were, the Third Anglo-Mysore War, he lost because the French Revolution happened in 1789. Louis XVI had promised that he would come, but he lost his head. He was guillotined, so he couldn't come. And Cornwallis attacked the Bangalore fort, 1791, March 21st, Bangalore falls. Then 1792, he defeats Tipu Sultan, but they sign a treaty. He doesn't completely defeat him, so there is some sharing of territory. He goes away. Tipu Sultan is not supposed, in terms of the treaty, he's not supposed to communicate with the French anymore. But you can't keep a good man down. So he was again communicating. There was no monarchy, was gone in France, but he was communicating with Napoleon, sending people there and saying that, come help us. Napoleon said, Comrade Tipu, I will come and I will lift the yoke of the British thing, because the British anyway, the French anyway hated the Brits, so anybody who was against the Brits, yes, I'm coming to help you. And Napoleon thought of himself as Alexander the Great. He wanted to be a world conqueror. He began to come. He came to Egypt, as far as Egypt. And then, in the Battle of the Nile, an English admiral called Nelson burnt the French fleet. And Napoleon was forced to turn back. He couldn't come. But if he had made that final leg of the sea journey from Egypt to South India, Bangalore and Karnataka and South India might have become part of a Franco-Islamic empire, and I'd have been conducting this talk in French. So South India could have become a different country, but for that little turn of history. Yeah, so that's the plot.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. First of all, I want to say thank you for. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
my name's Siddharth.
Namaskara.
Namaskara. What I want to say is thank you for the session. I think I was bursting with so much knowledge, so much insights. I've lived here my entire life, but still just always good to know more. Just one small thought. When you were narrating all these anecdotes, I just realized there's so much history with just the words, Pete, be it the Pete or Uru. And I just want to know your thoughts, like what I'm seeing is just this appropriation of these names. And with these misappropriation of these names, it loses value. Like if you just say Mysore, there's no meaning to it. You say Kabanpet, you can't explain. So I just like your thoughts on it.
Well, I have very little leg to stand on to answer that question because my book is called Becoming Bangalore, not Bengaluru. So I don't have much to say, but in the sense that I very thought about it a lot before calling it Becoming Bangalore, because everything is becoming Bengaluru. But having grown up in a city called Bangalore, I have always referred to it as Bangalore when I speak English and Bengaluru when I speak Kannada. It just rolls off the tongue more easily when you're speaking Kannada. Bengaluru hogtivi like that, but I'm going to Bangalore. Like you can't say I'm going to Bengaluru. It feels a bit odd on my tongue, so I decided I'll just embrace my age and I'll just call it Becoming Bangalore, because like the young people say, Bangalore is not a city, it's an emotion. So yeah, so that's what I've done with this. But that's why I think the government is so keen on making it back to Mysuru, Chikkamangaluru, Shivamogga, because yes, as you say, there are stories hidden in the names. Like we say, Sandra, Tipsandra. Sandra is actually Samudra. There must have been a lake there. So there are all these stories hidden in the words, actually. Palya, Sandra, they all mean something in Kannada. So instead of fighting it, I think if we educate ourselves on what those things mean and then tell everybody about it, they will be talked about with a little more understanding, and so that might be nice. Yeah.
I have a question. Yeah.
Oh, there was somebody there, sorry. Yeah.
Not so much behind in time. You would like to add something on the theatre culture that we have here?
Yeah. You can
Vijay
please.
Padaki?
Vijay Padaki is here.
Vijay Padaki is
English
here. Maybe
theatre.
he should just, yeah.
Theatre culture in Bangalore. Can you tell us something about the theatre culture of Bangalore?
Well,
Stand up.
Bangalore or Karnataka?
I don't know. Bangalore or Karnataka? Both.
Bangalore has had a very long tradition of theatre, but I think we should look at theatre outside the English language theatre.
Yeah.
English language theatre is trivial. Although I'm associated with it, it's really trivial. But Kannada theatre is very deep and with a very long history. It has had its ups and downs. Right now there seems to be a down. But
I think it's coming back though. I see a lot
ups.
of, yeah.
And as it's known from all over the world, the vibrancy of theatre depends on writers.
Yeah.
When you have lots of writers, the theatre is vibrant.
That's true.
And we've had those highs
Yeah.
in Karnataka and reflected in Bangalore on the Bangalore stage. We've had a great tradition of literature, and one subset of that has been writing for the stage.
That's true. Yeah. Heggodu, Ninasam, those are the big ones, no? And even Rajkumar was a theatre actor in Gubbi Veeranna's company before he became a iconic film star, Dr. Rajkumar. I think Kannada theatre is coming back though. I see a lot of young theatre groups, and definitely with all the stand-up comedy that's also happening on Instagram. I think that the tradition of performative arts in Kannada, in the local dialects, all that is coming back in a big way. So I hope we'll have some really good plays in Kannada.
A lot of people who speak Anya Matra Bhasha also learn Kannada,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You were saying something? Yeah. He wanted to say something.
Yeah, he was complimenting you. I think he finished complimenting.
Oh, okay, say.
Hi, Rupa. I think the last time we met, you were talking about a children's book and your work there.
Yeah.
And now you're in a different setting, and I love that about you. A quick question is in terms of, did you have any preconceived biases or notions towards Bangalore that you probably unlearned or uncovered through your journey of writing this book?
I've been born here and grew up here, so no chance for any biases, I think. In fact, what has happened while doing this book is half-baked insights that I had, and I didn't know where they came from, they have got more validated, that you were right in thinking this about Bangalore, and most of them are good things. You know, stuff that I felt, how come this city, you know, I used to I would say things like, when I was in college, that was so long ago, but it was perfectly fine in this city for 6 of us girls to walk into a pub at 3 o'clock in the afternoon after college and order a pitcher. Nobody would bat an eyelid. And that, I thought that was the normal thing in cities until I went to live in other places. And I found that those kinds of freedoms are just not available. And then I began to understand why people come here and do not leave. And you know, even in that time, what used to happen is all the Madras people used to come. They would be in hostels in Madras, and every weekend the buses would come in full of Madras kids to just get sloshed in Bangalore and then go back. So that was the tradition. So it's always been a place where it's, you know, welcoming, cosmopolitan, liberal, modern, very liberal in its thinking. And for that also, I think we have the Maharajas to thank. Very, very open, liberal Maharajas who were equally comfortable in the Western setting and equally comfortable with their roots, musically, linguistically, in their ideas,
and
ideology.
Very powerful Maharanis as well.
Very
right?
powerful Maharanis, yeah. I mean, powerful, ginta more independent and with a voice, you know.
And who did things,
Who did things, yeah. Okay, done, sorry. Thank you so much. It was lovely.
On behalf of BIC, I would like to thank Rupa Pai and Brinda Narayan for bringing the session to BIC. Thank you, audience, for your time and interest. Becoming Bangalore is available for sale, and Rupa will be signing the copies outside. Thank you.
Brinda.